Wikipedia, Facebook, Google, Twitter. They're all what I call public goods privately provided. The more I thought about this, the more I thought that this is kind of true of everything. I'll start this explanation by talking about a game, and let's talk about the game of tennis. The private goods of tennis are, say, the rackets because they're owned by particular players. The balls are a public good because they're shared by the players. Their clothes are private goods. The private goods are the things that amount to competition between the players. And it's had on a court. Well, the court plays a role very like the road. The rules are a public good. The rules are shared. When do we start complaining about a game? We start complaining about a game. We start complaining, oh, well, you cheated, or you're bending the rules. So that's the idea. And it turns out, I think, that you can apply this to any human interaction of any real significance. Welcome to another edition of Paying Attention. I'm Nicholas Grew, and I have my cup of green tea here, and I'd like to introduce you to my friend Peyton Bowman, and he'll introduce the subject, and then we'll get on with it.
So the subject is everyone's talking about Twitter these days. And Nicholas, I know that you've had a lot to say in the past about how social media is a kind of public good, and particularly Twitter, which Elon Musk just bought to save somehow free speech. But maybe you could tell me, what is a public good? I mean, we've talked about it before, but maybe we could talk about it and explain how it applies to this situation.
So I thought it'd be good to go right through, as quickly as we can, right through an economist's idea of what a public good is and my idea of what a public good is, which is exactly the economist's idea, but projected onto a much wider canvas. So let's start with what an economist thinks of as a public good. Let's think of a road, or rather, let's think of cars and roads. Cars are private goods because you buy them in the marketplace. You go to a dealer, second-hand or first-hand, and you buy a car, and guess what? It's of no use whatever until it is brought together. This private good is brought together with a public good, and that public good is a road. You can't go and buy a road in the marketplace. There are toll roads, but there are plenty of roads, your driveway, the local suburban roads, where it's completely impracticable to sell you a road. And because it can't be sold in a market, it has to be, we need them. So we get governments to tax us and supply us with those public goods. So that's a good informal definition of a public good. I could give you a technical definition. I won't bother at the moment, but it is something that won't create itself out of the marketplace, that everyone wants to use, and therefore typically is provided by government. And here's the big thing for me: private goods and public goods complement one another, and they are typically pretty much useless on their own. And cars and roads are the best. And cars and roads are the best example of that.
Right, because of course there's no point in having a road if you have no cars to drive on. Right?
That's right. Exactly right. That's exactly right.
Got it. So maybe we'll take this a little bit further. I know that you have tried to take this idea of public goods outside of the world of economics. What's a good example there of something?
So I want to make it, I mean, I've gradually become aware that, well, let me tell you sort of roughly how this happened to me. I started to think about public goods that were not provided by the government. Well, guess what? Some of the first that I was thinking of was Wikipedia, Facebook, Google, Twitter. They're all what I call public goods privately provided. But they now, and then I thought about some other things that have the same characteristic, but they're not made by the government. And the language we speak is an example of a public good. It's a kind of apex complementary good. We can't sort of get anywhere without language. and it's not provided by the government. You certainly don't go and buy it in the marketplace. So I'm starting to think to myself, well, this is interesting. The economists have got it's a very nice, neat idea of public goods and private goods. It's a strong way to think, and it's not an ideological way to think. It's just a kind of a very empirical. This is the beauty of economics for me, that it comes with these extremely simple ideas. And that's one of the reasons why economists overplay their hand so often, because they fall in love with those simple ideas. But if you can be careful not to overplay your hand, these are very simple and powerful ideas. So we've got these public goods privately provided. And then the more I thought about this, the more I thought that this is kind of true of everything. Now, I'll start this explanation by talking about a game. And let's talk about the game of tennis. Well, I now talk about the public goods of tennis and the private goods of tennis. What the hell am I talking about? Well, the private goods of tennis are, say, the rackets, because they're owned by particular players. The balls are a public good because they're shared by the players. Their clothes are private goods. The private goods are the things that amount to competition between the players, and it's had on a court. Well, the court plays a role very like the road. But here's something else, which is that the rules are a public good. The rules are shared. And so the structure of a game has the same structure of public and private goods as as cars and roads. And when you see that, you then sort of get to look at the game in a different kind of way. And so I can take you through a bit of that if you'd like.
Well, I think definitely, and I can see it's what you mean by the words rules. By the word rules, it has a kind of, there's a lot of abstract things that govern the game of tennis. You know, you said that the racket is a private good, but you're not allowed to just bring any kind of racket you want onto the court. And,
that's right. So those are rules. So those are the rules, or rules. Often just the traditions. The traditions
as well. Yeah,
that's right. And you can see this emerge in school playgrounds around every country, which is that kids make up games. And so, what is a game? Well, it is typically a competition between two or more people who agree on what you will compete about is to make rules, and those rules are a shared good, a shared property. Now, the thing that I think is really quite interesting to think about then is you could have good games and bad games. Now, I mean, they can just sort of have dumb rules, but typically we start complaining. When do we start complaining about a game? We start complaining about a game when we start complaining, oh, well, you cheated, or you're bending the rules. Mm-hmm. So this idea of the fact that we share rules and we compete over how good our tennis shot is. We shouldn't compete. We won't ultimately get any real satisfaction from competing by saying, oh, no, that was out when it was not out. Right. And so on. And we've all got a very strong intuitive sense of this. So this leads to the idea that a healthy game is a game where what I call the ecology of the private and the shared, the ecology of public and private goods is a healthy ecology. Each one supports the other. What's unhealthy is when the shared goods, when competition breaks out in this area where it doesn't make sense for there to be competition. So there's no sense in which Roger Federer at one end and Rafael Nadal at the other end with trying to manipulate the rules. Most people understand that doesn't make the game better, it makes it worse. Yeah. So that's the idea, and it turns out, I think, that you can apply this to pretty much any any human interaction of any real significance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really an interesting way of looking at things, and it's also worth noting. I think when you were talking about good games and bad games, I do think that some games, for example, tic-tac-toe is not a good game because the rules don't support, let's say, enough private creativity in a sense.
Yeah, that's right.
You can only really play tic-tac-toe one way, and you can't lose if you play it the right way, right?
That's right.
But with tennis, the rules there, they support creativity, they support different styles of play, and they allow for this truly kind of what we might think of as excellence at playing tennis to somehow emerge organically from the system.
Exactly right.
Set up by the public good. Exactly
right. And I'll just add there, this is a bit of an aside, but just something to think about. One of the reasons we like sport is that sport is one of the few fields of human endeavour where we can have immense confidence that the people at the top are really the best.
Yeah.
Notice I said the people. I mean, whether Djokovic is a greater player than Federer, we can argue. But we don't have to argue about whether Djokovic is a better tennis player than me or you.
Right.
And that's different with, just to mention Elon Musk before we talk about him later on, I could say, look, he's been incredibly lucky. He's not really a very good business person. He's had a great run for 10 or 15 years and he's going to fall on his face. Well, who knows? Yeah. But there are certainly plenty of cases where business people have done incredibly well for a long time and been shown to be basically pretty incompetent. And this is true of politicians, and most of the things in our lives are not so well set up that we can be sure that the people who've clambered to the top are really the most meritorious.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, that's certainly part of the narrative around Elon Musk and some of these other titans of industry. I think without going a little bit too off, well, how would this apply to, say, someone like Donald Trump? So, for example, I think Donald Trump breaks rules, right? Breaks the norms, the social norms of politics. And that makes some people really dislike him, complaining about destroying the public good, and makes some people really, really like him, right? So there's a sense, though, I think, which you can also speak about without maybe going too much into the controversy around Trump, which is how these public goods have evolved in the 21st century, and especially in forums like, we talked about roads and we talked about games, but, how is social media, let's say, this kind of public good? I mean, isn't it something anybody can use in any way, or is there a sense in which culture itself could be thought of in this way? Or
well, before we get to that, why don't we talk about? So I wanted to make a kind of more preparatory to that. I want to just talk about this conversation. So in this conversation, we are together, a bit like an informal game of tennis. We are tacitly governing this conversation. You talk, I talk, and we might, I don't know, we might compete in the conversation to, we might disagree with you or vice versa. Or we might try to persuade the other person that they're wrong. But if we disrupt the idea that the conversation itself is a shared asset that we're both working on, then we end up with a really bad conversation. So I think that's an important thing to think about. And it's also an important, and now when you think about someone like Trump, it seems to me that that's sort of roughly one of the things that Trump has done is he's come along to a game that everyone's sick of, and he's basically breaking all the rules. Now, I certainly don't want to. I certainly don't want to say that the game that he was disrupting was a good game, but and I suppose this is a good illustration of the fact that there isn't a proper umpire in politics. Although you can say that the voters are umpires, so long as people don't start lying about whether they won or lost elections and so on. So there is an umpire in some kind of way. but that's a very distant umpire which every 4 years says you won or you won, and the rest of it is governed by the participants. And I think it's really a quite, if I might say so humbly, modestly, immodestly, I think it's a very powerful analysis of our current democracy, that it is a conversation that everyone is trying to hijack, that they're not really trying to, in a debate or any kind of public political participation, no one is trying to explore issues and get to the right answer. Almost no one is trying to build some kind of community consensus. They're practicing the dark arts of manipulating emotions, manipulating a conversation, trying to frame what their opponents are saying is as kind of crazy, and what they're saying is, what all red-blooded Americans or Australians think. So, and that to me is a very fundamental reason that everyone feels so terrible about politics, because they can feel that this is put on. They can feel its inauthenticity. There's just no. I regard it as kind of uninhabitable, and it's all because the ecology of the private competition, which is entirely appropriate in a democracy, and the rules of the game that they're playing are not healthy ones. They're not the everybody's interest in the conversation, when people being tied down to some extent, and in the participants actually trying to narrow differences, say where they really disagree, where they don't disagree. It's kind of nowhere. It's in a terrible state.
So, well, thank you for bringing that back to that conversation, because I do think that's an interesting baseline, because a conversation is cooperative fundamentally, unless you really want to go in and, I don't know, for some reason just dominate or convince somebody but it's some way, right?
That's right, but it's quite legit. A conversation is a very flexible thing, far more flexible than a game of tennis, and it's entirely legitimate for a conversation to be as aggressive as both people want it to. I mean, the people might, like a roast, that's an American term, where Sammy Davis Jr. gets roasted. Well, it's not exactly a conversation, but people sending each other up, people having a laugh at each other's expense. That's a perfectly good conversation if the participants understand that that's what they're doing. It's also a perfectly good conversation for people to be even quite aggressive with each other if they're debating mathematics or something, and one's convinced they're right and that they can prove that the other one is wrong. But most of if you're trying to talk about political issues, it's usually a terrible way to proceed. But it's the way that is most effective for each of the participants, and therefore the centre basically gets vacated, and it's like a game of tennis where everyone's saying, my ball was in and your ball was out, and that was a let and all that sort of stuff.
Besides, though, a few periods in political history, though, do you think there has been a time where politics operated more or less in the way that a good conversation operated?
That's probably not the case. But what was the case was that politics before about 30 or 40 years ago typically represented, in most places, 2 or sometimes 3 parties that were quite well integrated into the community. Something like 2% of the population would be members of political parties. It's a fraction of 1% now. They would go along to branch meetings, and there would be a left-wing party representing workers and a right-wing party representing small business and stuff like that, representing kind of community logics, if you like. And I think there was quite a lot of authenticity in politics in those times, even though everybody was you didn't expect candidates to say, yeah, we don't have a very good case there or something like that. I just think it's become, what's happened now is that most of that has fallen away, and politics is kind of about brand management. It's about a team of professionals manipulating this brand like Coke and Pepsi, and people can feel manipulated. They can feel that whatever they're being told, whatever they're being promised, it doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel that if circumstances change, though, all those implicit reassurances mightn't disappear. So there's something there's something that I think has got a lot worse. But the other thing that I would say is that that for the last 230 odd years, we've been running modern democracy on this competitive basis. And we have talked about this before, that you can run, there are two ways to represent the people. One that I can think of, one is competitively via elections, and the other is the way we do it in juries, which is by sampling from the community. And both of them set up conversations, and elections set up very combative, adversarial conversations. And what we are seeing is that the sense that people have of two clear alternatives, each with some integrity, is sort of disappearing. And we're seeing that conversation radically degraded. And then in a jury, it's the same problem. The jury has the same problem as a political system, which is, what should we do? Is this person guilty or are they not guilty? If you were a citizens' jury deciding a great political issue like should we have a carbon tax, it's the same story. The group has to come up with a decision. But the dynamics of the conversation in a group like that are going to be hugely different. And probably, I was going to say maybe we don't go into it in any great detail here, but that is kind of relevant to the Twitter story. Our society is, all the power comes from this competitive discussion. All the political power is anchored to the competitive discussion, because that's how we've structured our democracy, and that's what social media is doing, and then there's this other way to deliberate. That's the situation that we find ourselves in, and I think that these competitive structures undermine a great deal. And in fact, before we talk about Twitter, I think it would also be useful to talk about institutions generally.
Yeah.
Starting with a Q or something like that.
That sounds good. I did have one thought about, when we're discussing conversations, and I wonder if there's a way in which we have, in the kind of former time, there was a sense of which there was a shared purpose, a shared end towards which everything was working. And in that sense, could that kind of purpose be a sort of public good? For example, like if we say, for example, it used to be, I feel there was a lot of general consensus about, let's say, going to the moon, so this at least seemed like a nice goal. Everyone could kind of get behind it. Maybe you disagreed on the mechanics of how you did it or the speed at which you did it, probably going back further, there were ideas in American history about, expanding, and I'm speaking about American history. Apologies again for always bringing that kind of example, but the expansion of let's say, the United States to cover a lot of North America or something along these lines. So there's a sense in which everyone kind of wanted that. They disagreed on how to do that. But now it seems like, and this I think will be something we can touch on more when we talk about Twitter and social media and these things, but people want to, I think in your word, colonize the mechanics of the debate. They want to privatize that public idea. Okay, we are going to start arguing about it this way, and we're going to argue about the topic this way, And then if you want to bring up some grander goal, like, I don't know, going to the moon or having a good economy, people kind of, they're sort of like, well, that's not really important. That's not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about how we're talking, not what we're trying to talk about. And I wonder if that's relevant to your analysis of,
well, yeah, the one I think about is on Fox News, where I just remember watching an interview which begins, it's one of these studio interviews where with Fox and Friends or something. So it's a setup. It's not it's not a hostile question to someone, but it's a hostile question anyway. And the thing is, you say to someone, do you think diversity training in the military will help us win the next war?
Yeah.
With the Russians invading Ukraine, do you think it's a good time to introduce diversity training to the military? Now, I mean, what you're doing is you're framing a conversation in an entirely tendentious way.
Yeah.
Whether and what kind of diversity training the military should have is a question of some interest. I'm certainly not a big fan of lots of aspects of that. I'm a fan of diversity, but not of quite a lot of the way in which it's been bureaucratized. But obviously, it's just the way you introduce the whole debate in a way that makes one side simply look laughable because it's not an answer to that question. So that's the sort of thing that just goes on all the time. And again, this is our public discourse is dominated by competition. So Fox is competing for viewers and MSNBC is competing for viewers, and these the views that they represent somehow are seen to be competitive and so on. And in a naive kind of view, this is kind of good because the truth comes out of a free market in ideas. But what we can see is that chaos comes out of a free market in ideas. And if you want to get at the truth, it's harder work than that. And it isn't just a matter of letting people yell at each other. A bit like a tennis game, you've got a lot of things have to be understood as shared before you can start building the skill level up. And we haven't done that. We haven't done that in our discourse. We've done the exact opposite.
Yeah. I mean, and even this idea of free market of ideas, it's a very misleading thing to say because as you've noted in a lot of places that free markets depend on a lot of structure too. We have to agree, how much a dollar is worth, and we have to agree on what different measurements are. And this works even better when we have unfree elements that are kind of governing the situation,
Yeah, so markets themselves, like a game of tennis, they depend upon shared things that are shared, typically the rules of the game. Science or getting at the truth is actually even harder than that because and this is what we've done in our universities. We've set up a game, and it's a kind of a shared game, which is who can publish the biggest number of high status peer-reviewed articles. So it's a kind of fair game in a sense, but it's a stupid game. and we are turning out careerists who don't care too much about the truth because they want to get that article published. And getting an article published, it turns out, is much easier for a kind of conventional paper that doesn't take things very far, that most people will agree on. So it's it gets through the peer review process easily enough. So the whole business of getting to the truth is even harder than getting a good market going. A good market, in a good market, you've got these trades going on all the time, buying and selling, and for every trade, the buyer gets something that they want more than the money they parted with, and the seller, the seller is in a similar position. This is completely different with discourse. So one of the things we've done is that we have taken an analogy from economics about markets generating efficient results, and in the right circumstances, there's little doubt that they do. And we've projected that onto things like universities. And then we've sort of looked around for a money substitute, and the money substitute turns out to be number of articles published in high status journals. And it turns out that's fairly easily gamed, and academics who are just trying to get articles, get the volume of articles going up, yes, it's a hard thing to do. So we end up with some of the people at the top who are quite clever, but they may not be contributing anything, and they can also contribute to major sort of bubbles in thinking, if you like, speculative bubbles where a particular fad comes along and everybody publishes a few papers in line with that fad. So it's a much more delicate business.
Well, I think to talk a little bit about institutions, I mean, what if we take Thomas Hobbes' view and just say people are competitive, they don't get along very well, and the only reason they cooperate is because there's a big scary government or a big scary monarch that's telling them what to do. Yeah. Well, what do you think about that? I mean, I know that you would disagree with that statement.
Yeah, I do. It's not a bad thing to keep in mind as a kind of backdrop to the question of government, which may ultimately get down to coercive force, the ability to force people to obey the law or end up suffering consequences. But we are a hyper-cooperative species. We are constantly cooperating, and we cooperate in this pattern that we spoke about earlier about public and shared, about private activity against a background of shared understanding. So take an example of a queue, which I think I don't know whether Americans know what a queue is, but they use the word line. People getting in line to buy a hamburger or to get on a plane. This is a spontaneous activity, and it is, again, it partakes of this structure of public and private goods at a micro level. So what's the public good in a queue or a line? It is everybody's understanding that their bodies create an analog computer, in fact, which is their bodies create the order in which they go to the next stage. And everyone knows that there is a kind of social utility in this order. They know that there's a social utility generally, and there's also a utility to them. Obviously, there's more utility to the people at the front than the back, but there's enough utility to the people near the back. Some of the people at the back might just sort of wander off because there's nothing much to be gained from queuing up. But everyone gains from this by entering into a world of mutual obligation. Those mutual obligations, which are, I won't push in, I'm expecting you not to push in, or I expect you not to push in, I understand you expect me not to push in. That's the ground, that's the shared ground on which a queue or a line develops. And we just do this very naturally. And if Thomas Hobbes wants to come up with a political theory, his political theory is sitting in the background saying we may need force and we may need to all agree on what that force is. That's fine. But please try and take as much advantage of these innate qualities that we have and our capacity to do these things very, very generally. So I've got a quote here from William James, the American pragmatist philosopher around about the turn of the 20th century, because if you take that example of the queue, he hasn't started there, but let's say that he did. Let's just go on with this quote. A social organism of any sort whatever, whether large or small, is what it is because each member proceeds to his own duty with a trust that the other members will simultaneously do theirs, just like I was saying. Wherever a desired result is achieved by the cooperation of many independent persons, Its existence as a fact is a pure consequence of the faith in one another of those immediately concerned. A government, an army, a commercial system, a ship, a college, an athletic team, all exist on this condition, without which not only is nothing achieved, but nothing is even attempted. So that's an incredibly important fact about our lives that people kind of miss when they think that, our society consists of individuals and then a government telling us what to do. It's a very rich, we have this rich repertoire, this ability to cooperate. And also, whenever we build these things, we create the ability for private actors to try and get a bit more than they deserve. And that's kind of the dynamic of our world. And I think this idea of public and private goods, and this gives you an idea of its scope and its range, is a very powerful way to think, because it's not very ideological. It's not telling you shared is better than individual. It's not telling you individual is better than shared. It's saying that these things are inextricably entangled, and the quality of that entanglement will determine the quality of the institution and therefore the quality of our lives. So I think that's a pretty cool way to think about these institutional questions, and it gives us a pretty good introduction into thinking about what the hell we do with, what's happened on social media and what the hell we should do, and what we should think about, Twitter being owned by a single person and what they might do and so on.
Yeah, I think that this idea of entanglement is really important. So, so if we look at, let's say, social media, Twitter, there's sort of, like you say, they're public goods that are not provided by government. They're provided by a private business. I do know that there has been talk about how, ever since, I think it really started with the Arab Spring, people started talking about Twitter as a kind of public utility. And at that time, there was a very, optimistic idea about the role that Twitter could play as a digital town square, which is also a term that Elon Musk used. So, well, what is Twitter? Is it a business? Is it a utility? I mean, and is it an entangled good? I think that is sort of the obvious answer, but I mean, should it be one way? Should it be more the other way? Or how should it be thought? How should we think about it?
So think about Twitter being set up. Now, let's imagine that the people setting up Twitter had some foresight, because Twitter didn't make money for ages and ages and ages. Now it's a pretty valuable company. But they got to make a decision. So a public good like a road is a public good of necessity, because it's not practical for us to charge for the use of the road. You could say that's now changing with it's possible to charge for the use of the road, and then I'd say, well, it's actually probably almost certainly a bad idea, even if we could, for reasons I won't go into. But with the public goods that we've looked at before, they cost money to build, and so we raise taxes, and then we say everyone can play on them now for nothing. Now, Twitter could have said, we're creating value with this network. We're going to, and it was perfectly possible to put it behind a paywall. So they could have said, we're creating value, and we're going to charge you all $10 a month to be on this wonderful network. And of course, it knew that it wouldn't get going at all if it charged.
Yeah.
So the question is, could it build this public good? Could it build this good, and could it monetize it in some way? And the answer is yes, of course it could. So if it charged $10 a month, it might have ended up with 10 or 15 million people on it, and that it'd be a nice little business, and they might make $10 million a year in profit or something like that. And in that context, they generate a small amount of value, and they capture most of it through fees. And then the alternative is to build a public good, which is free and open, and the usage takes off, and I don't know how many, it's several 100 million are on Twitter now, I think. Maybe only, maybe a bit less. Certainly, the classic example is Facebook, which is about 3 billion or something like that. So they have, or just Google search, which is a free public good, and it's used by more than 3 billion people. So it's so cheap to produce these things that you can do it, and you can do it by getting enough revenue from a fraction of the value you create, and you get that from advertising. So I haven't looked at it on Twitter, but on Google, according to the back of my envelope, about Google gets in revenue about 6 cents in every dollar of value that they create. Well, that makes them richer than anybody's wildest dreams, except for Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. Yeah. So it's viable. Now, the equivalent here is to build a freeway from the revenue that you get from billboards along the road. Well, you can't do it because the freeway costs you far too much money. So these public goods can be privately provided, and therefore were privately provided. Mm. And then we look at the Arab Spring and we go, well, that's very interesting. These private businesses have got the quality of public goods. Isn't that wonderful? We got them for free. Or you can argue about the cost of the advertising. And then now we're starting to see other public goods that aren't just about the network, but about the algorithms on the network. Mm. So you can have algorithms that rev people up, or you can have algorithms that introduce people who might be most likely to get on. Mm. And there are I think we talked about alternatives there, and we could go into that a bit more if you like. But those things are public goods, but they're being set by a private individual for profit or a private company. And of course, they're not really that interested in the state of civilization. They're interested in the state of their profits. And so now we've brought this. So what's happening at the moment is that people are debating Twitter as a public good with an economic model in their mind, whereas I'm suggesting that the whole idea of public goods is one that can be taken into a cultural dimension. And then we would look at these algorithms and things like that. And that's kind of what we have to be thinking about. And we have to be thinking about the mismatch between the private incentives to the owner or owners and the fact that this is a public good and our culture is being sitting on the platform and being manipulated by the platform. So that's a pretty big deal, I think.
So, I mean, I think that it's interesting that you bring up these algorithms, and they speak to something that Elon Musk posted shortly after he purchased, in which maybe I can just read now and kind of go through some of the points that he sort of chose to highlight. So, free speech is the bedrock of a functioning democracy, and Twitter is the digital town square where matters vital to the future of humanity are debated, said Mr. Musk. I also want to make Twitter better than ever by enhancing the product with new features, making the algorithms open source to increase trust, defeating the spam bots, and authenticating all humans. Twitter has tremendous potential. I look forward to working with the company and the community of users to unlock it. So there are a lot of terms in there, I think, that kind of jumped out to me in this speech about this private and public, this kind of way of looking at things. We mentioned the digital town square, but what about this question of, well, before we get into this idea of making the algorithms open source, which I think is an interesting aspect to it, and then, of course, some of these others, which are a bit raise kind of some eyebrows. He says Twitter has tremendous potential. I look forward to working with the company, which is this, this private, and the community of users, the public, to unlock it. I mean, what is this potential that Twitter has, and how would this community and company play together?
So here I need to say I'm not making predictions. I'm not saying, and so, I can't tell, handing something over to Elon Musk is a scary business. But then it's a scary state of affairs right now, where such an important public asset, such an important public good, a public network, a public utility, is simply run for profit. So that's what we have at the moment. The thing we know about Elon Musk is that he's a man of extraordinary ambition, an entrepreneur, possibly kind of unprecedented, at least among successful entrepreneurs, which is that he takes punts, he takes positions on what he regards as civilizationally significant projects. So we know that he's done this with electric cars to great success so far. He's done it. I think it's basically a crackpot idea, but he's wants human beings to escape Earth and move to Mars to survive, the nuclear holocaust, which may be upon us sooner than we think. And then he's pursued a range of other things of very, very of great significance. And now what I'm hoping Elon Musk is thinking is that Twitter can be made, is that he's not buying Twitter to maximize money making. He is, I can't prove that, and I might easily be wrong, but I want to just go with that as a scenario. I don't think I think it's unlikely that he's buying it to be charitable. But I think as far as money making is concerned, what he may, if I could tell a story in which he will end up making far more money by doing the right thing. And the story, I mean, this has been done. We've seen this again and again. When you get this technology that scales extraordinarily, like the internet does, it turns out that it pays you to be greedy, long-term greedy, not short-term greedy. So Google mainly beat its competitors by having better technology, but it also beat its competitors by trying to give the best possible experience to people searching. So it didn't clutter the screen with ads or any of that stuff. When it introduced ads, it introduced them in a way that was very clear what was an ad and what was not. It's now in the search for more and more profits, it's now compromising that. But early on, that's one of the ways it did what it did. Facebook, precisely the same. If you look at the competition between Facebook and MySpace, Facebook was much less focused on generating advertising revenue right now, and much more focused on the possibilities of the platform for networking and so on. Now, so the short-term profit maximizing way to run Twitter, we can assume, is roughly what they're doing at the moment, which is that they control the algorithm and they decide what gets boosted and what doesn't. But it's a very interesting question to say, what if we set up an open market and open sourcing of those algorithms? Then I go onto Twitter, probably a good idea if I get some experience before I make these decisions, but then I go, yeah, look, I don't really want to be shown a whole lot of things that are going to just rev me up for no reason. I want to be shown people who I disagree with, but who I'm likely to respect, for instance. So that's one of the things that Elon Musk is talking about, and you can see how in the short run it's likely to be bad for his profits. Why? Because if it was that easy, it would already have been done. In the longer run, it could easily turn Twitter into a much more powerful network than, say, Facebook or whatever. so there are so again, yeah. So these are the ways in which this sort of unpacking this idea of public goods, and particularly cultural public goods, starts to give us a new way to look at what the possibilities are. And one of the sad things, I think, is that people who have represented or claim to represent the public interest and think of themselves as representing the public interest, they're not really thinking like this. They're mostly thinking about government regulation. And I'm not sort of someone who thinks government regulation is necessarily a terrible idea, but it's pretty flat-footed, and it's on a subject like this, and also highly compromised by power. And I think we should be trying to develop institutions that are trying to not just protect against the downsides, but really optimize the upsides. So that's one of the things that's in play.
So he talks about making these algorithms open source. So that, in a way, makes what's a private into a public good. Do you think that will help, or not?
Well, I would say that they are public. That algorithms are public goods, sort of by definition. Nobody pays for these things, but they're privately specified and privately controlled, and that's a problem. So, open sourcing them. I mean, again, it's not. That's sort of changing. If everybody has chooses something different, it's not quite the same as a public good, but it's a sort of shared environment that they build for themselves. I guess I don't know whether just making it voluntary, just allowing people to tweak the dial. In other words, I don't know whether maximizing freedom here, it leaves me with a bunch of doubts that it's the optimal thing. I think it's pretty I think reasonable case can be made that it's a lot better than what we have. And I think it's the right pathway to go on. It's the right set of instincts to mobilize to say, well, let's try to focus on the algorithms, and let's try to get mechanisms for selecting these algorithms that aren't dictated by power and aren't, in the first instance, dictated by profit. We want them dictated by some notion of human betterment. Unfortunately, in our cultural consumption practices, we're not very good at that. So we will tune into sport and things that are very easily digested. Think of commercial radio. We shy away from things that are a little more difficult to absorb. And I think that's a fairly big problem. Which is not I doubt if Elon Musk is thinking about that. But anyway, it just seems to me that it is at least whether we again, I don't really want to say we should hand this thing over to Elon Musk. I'm not going to make that decision, fortunately.
Yeah.
But the issue that Elon Musk has raised, I think, is absolutely the right one. And thinking about this. And thinking about the network having value and the potential for collective intelligence to be enhanced by that network, I think that's a really valuable idea, and it's not really and a pure profit motive from Wall Street is not really a great way to husband those new possibilities in this world.
Well, the last point he makes is one of the more eyebrow-raising ones, which is when he mentions that he wants to authenticate all the humans. And that's an interesting point because, well, it could simply mean getting rid of a bunch of spam bots. Yeah. And mechanically, you can sort of imagine, okay, like sometimes when I have to sign up for a bank or something, I have to send them my picture or something along these lines, my driver's license, to prove who I am.
Yep.
And I think there's a lot we could get into on this one that, I want to stay a little bit on the surface here because we can talk a bit about how Twitter has historically approached the idea of anonymous accounts and the role anonymous accounts play in this kind of public speech. But what I do kind of think is interesting and relevant is, what does it mean to authenticate a human in the world of this public-private debate, right? So if I am on Twitter and I'm talking to somebody and I don't know who they are.
Yeah.
And of course, that human identity is, of course, in a way, partially a public good, and it's partially a private good because it belongs to, the person who owns it, like our names. We own our names, but we don't give ourselves names most of the time. Do you think that, at least in the sense of trying to create maybe an authentic identity on the platform, do you think that that improves it by making one aspect of it a bit more public, or not?
My instinct is to say that it does. But I remember early on in this process, I chaired this thing called the Government 2.0 Task Force for the federal government in Australia, and I was pretty keen on pseudonymous accounts because there were three or four people who were blogging from government bureaucracies, and it was important to them to remain pseudonymous. So it wasn't totally anonymous because this person retained a pseudo, they retained a pseudonym, so you knew who you were talking about, and you could you were engaging with them as a person, you just didn't know exactly their name. So you can certainly, if you want to say that everybody has to be identified by their name, that will certainly choke off that possibility, and that is a cost. Again, I think it's likely to be extremely valuable and Twitter already has this, but I don't know what it does, what impact it has on the algorithm, but those little blue stars on Twitter are authenticated people.
Yeah.
And if you made that more and more normal and then invited people to, and then started thinking about how people want to interact with non-authenticated partners in conversation, I think that's the right way to go about it, to try to get an outcome to emerge which captures as much of the good stuff as you can get from authentication while leaving room for some pseudonymous accounts. So that, for instance, an algorithm, one of the names of one of these people who we know who he is now, and he now writes columns for The Guardian here, but his pseudonym as a public servant was Grog's Gamut, would you believe? And he would an algorithm would, by you would easily be able to run sentiment analysis over his past columns to realize that he's a perfectly normal human being. He's not expressing himself in an excitable way at all. And so, he could appear Grog's Gamut, pseudonym, public servant, and that would be good. So that's my answer, which is there's no one size fits all. You want to have a decentralized process, but a process that is trying to get to the result of getting the best of all these different possibilities.
Yeah. I think it's a constantly interesting question in the case of the internet. And I imagine it'll become more of a, as we have more of this sense in which we try to combat spam, fake accounts, that conflict between the anonymous, the pseudonymous, I think I'm saying that right.
Yep.
And
you got it right.
There's obviously a lot of value in it, especially when it allows you to kind of engage in parrhesia in a way you might not be able to as someone who has to, like, let's say, working in a company where they can't really speak about what's going on in there or something along these lines. But it does it is interesting about how we build these identities online and how we can, this will move forward. And, You know, especially if there's an authentication system on something like Twitter.
Yep.
So I guess we can kind of maybe talk a little bit about, you know, just to wrap up the conversation.
Yep.
About how, you know, we've spoken about institutions as being a public, you know, having public goods, and the kind of importance of the entanglement of public and private goods and institutions.
Yeah.
And we've spoken now about Twitter. And what about, do you think that this has anything to say about the larger cultural context in which we are right now?
Well, it's very centrifugal.
Yeah.
We are in a centrifugal age. All the forces of profit are to push us into kind of atomized existence as consumers. And we desperately need ways to produce centripetal institutions which bring people together. The potential of things like social media, and I'm a huge beneficiary of this. We are, if you agree that this has been fun, this wouldn't have happened. You and I, our conversations wouldn't have happened without the internet. So you're in Japan, I'm in Australia. So there are aspects to this that are incredibly valuable. And we became aware of those aspects at the beginning of this, and then we found out that there were these terribly dangerous and damaging aspects. So, you know, power and our capacity for forgetfulness is on the side of dissolution, and we have to try and bring about greater integration and greater coming together, and that can be done at a global scale, but and also at quite a small scale, so that the people who are particularly interested in a particular thing or see the world in a particular way and who want to help each other articulate those things, well, those things can, thousands of those flowers can bloom. But the problem is trying not to get them drowned out by the simpler forms of life. So that's a challenge for our age, I'm afraid.
Well, I'll just have to see if Elon Musk is flinging people out into space, if he can help bring us together on Earth. We'll see.
That's right.
Well, this has been a great conversation, Nicholas, and thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Peyton.